You're listening to the Vint Wine Podcast, where you'll hear interviews and stories from around the wine world. From writers and critics to winemakers and sommeliers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping wine culture. Enjoy the show.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Vint Wine Podcast. I am your host, Billy Galanko, and today we have another fantastic returning guest. She was actually a guest in the earliest days of the Vint Wine Podcast. I think within year one, we have the one and only Lisa Perrotti-Brown. Many of you may know her from her time at the Wine Advocate. She spent many years reviewing the top wines of the world, including Bordeaux and Napa. She was editor-in-chief. From there, she went on, co-founded the Wine Independent, and she has since moved on and founded her own website called The Wine Palate. It is a fantastic new platform, and we will get more details about that in a minute. But before we dive into our time with Lisa, I just want to share a little bit from my past weekend. Actually, I have two, now that I think about it. We had the Fête du Champagne, but I also went to the Wines of Hungary seminar. So in the past week, I've got to meet two of our recent guests, people I've always wanted to meet in person. Obviously, I've spoken with them online, but I got to meet John Szabo at the Wines of Hungary seminar here in Los Angeles. It was a great seminar. We went through a number of different wines from all over the country, and it was really great, number one, to see a full house of trade people from Los Angeles. There's a lot of folks I know from the industry here who are somms, and it was great to see them boning up on their Hungarian wine knowledge, and I'm hoping to see a lot more on the wine list here around LA, and also just in distribution books around the country. So that was fantastic. Got to meet John. And then at the Fête du Champagne, I went to the seminar in the morning, the Champagne from Soil to Sip seminar. And it was really fascinating. It was panel, and it was led by Peter Liem, which was fantastic. And it was Dominique Demarville of Lallier and Mathilde Margan of A. Margan. And they were both able to talk about how each of their houses approaches their winemaking, what makes their unique styles. And it was almost like listening to an episode of this podcast without being the host. It was like Peter Liem was hosting this podcast. So it was really cool. I got to meet Peter right after, spoke with him, got him to sign my champagne book. And then from there, we went on to the grand tasting. And it was a fantastic tasting. For anyone who hasn't made it before, there are people at this tasting from all over the West Coast and Mountain West. I highly recommend going, checking it out. I didn't even go to the gala, which there was a ton of people I knew in the wine industry who were there actually working just so they could go to the gala later. I definitely need to make it to the gala next year. It sounded like it was going to be a blast. But even so, there were so many amazing producers. Just to name a few, obviously there was a lot of the most famous, well-known houses like Bollinger. There was Dom Perignon. There was Krug. One of my favorites was Lamblot. They were making some really unique expressions of Meunier. I almost did not stop there. I had planned to come back to them. They were right by the front door. And I asked Peter partway through our tasting, we caught up a little bit more, and I asked him where he would recommend tasting if there was somewhere just so I wouldn't miss anything. And he recommended Lamblot. That was really great. It's Lamblot. Great producer, really unique wines. Tasted all over. Philippe Pinot was there. Eric Rodet was there. Roederer, V-Mart. Oh, that was actually one of the fun parts with V-Mart. I got to taste what Peter, I don't know if you all remember, but he was talking about how they tend to have a higher dosage. And it's not because they have a policy of having higher dosage. It's that they just every year they do a lot of bench trials, and then they always end up picking the one that tastes the best, and it always ends up having a higher dosage. So that was pretty cool. I went and tasted a number of wines there, and they did have between 7 to 9 grams of dosage. So that was really interesting and rang true to what Peter was saying. And yeah, across the board, it was just fantastic to taste so many wines from top champagne houses and top growers all in one spot and really get to compare and dig in. So highly recommend it for anyone next year. If it's in your area, check it out in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, definitely worth the trip. Like I said, there were people even working this event who came from the East Coast just to work the event in Los Angeles. So it was a great time. Keep your eyes out for it next year. But for today, we get back to Lisa Perrotti-Brown and the Wine Palate. And it was really interesting to hear about where Lisa wanted to take the Wine Palate and how she was using basically all of her knowledge from over the years she's basically taking everything that she thought was not as helpful from the Wine Advocate and the way that they were doing things with the Wine Independent, and tried to transform that to make it as user-friendly and able to be dialed in as possible for any wine consumers. So the way that you can search through their reviews or their articles, you can really put in all of your preferences, and the little knobs that you can dial in for this in your profile are so precise. There were certain things like, do you like a little bit of Brettanomyces? Do you not? Like very specific flavors, very specific winemaking impacts. So if, for instance, like the type of oak you like, American versus French, if you like heavy new oak, those are just a couple examples. Once you create your profile, you can really, really personalize it beyond anything I've ever seen. And then again, she has a crack team of experts who are writing reviews along with herself, and everything on the Wine Palate is just so thoughtful. She was able to give me access to it before our chat, and then she walked me through it a little bit during our conversation, and it was really fascinating. And I highly recommend everybody goes and gets a subscription to check out the Wine Palate if you want to have very personalized wine recommendations. Obviously, they're reviews, but they basically will then present you the wines with the reviews and the profiles that best fit what you're looking for. So it's a good way if you're trying to discover new wines or to find wines that fit your specific profile, just to really have it honed in by experts. So it was really great to have Lisa back on. She is a wealth of knowledge. I always forget that she first met Robert Parker in a tasting in Asia. She worked in Singapore for a long time. She's been all over the world and really helped shape the world of wine as we know it today. So it was a pleasure to have her back on, and I hope everybody enjoys the interview as much as I did. So without further ado, here is Lisa Perrotti-Brown, Master of Wine. Hi, Lisa. Thanks so much for joining today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you back on the podcast. It's been a long time since you've been on. Maybe for some of our newer listeners, can you give a little bit of background on who you are, and then we'll dive into the Wine Palate as well.
Yeah, I am a Master of Wine. I got my Master of Wine in 2008, and I have been working in the wine industry a lot longer than that. I started in the wine industry in the early 90s, living in London. Worked for 13 years in the UK wine trade, then wound up going to Tokyo, Japan, and lived and worked there as a wine buyer for a wine importer for about 5 years. Met Robert Parker, of all people, in Japan. I hit it off with him. I was organizing some events for him. He was over there. And then wound up going to Singapore. I lived in Singapore for 8 years. And just as I was moving to Singapore in 2008, I got my Master of Wine, and also Robert Parker asked me if I wanted to come on board for the Wine Advocate and cover the wines of Australia and New Zealand, which actually weren't that far from Singapore. I started working for the Wine Advocate in 2008, and then fast forward to 2013, the Wine Advocate was purchased by a group of Singaporean shareholders, and I became the editor-in-chief. And then I started taking on more responsibilities in terms of reviewing. I started reviewing the wines of California, Napa, Sonoma, California Central Coast, and also Bordeaux. And then in 2021, I left the Wine Advocate. This is after it was sold to Michelin. Started a new publication with a group of shareholders based out of Sweden called the Wine Independent. And then earlier this year, I decided I wanted to do something different. So I departed the Wine Independent and started up the Wine Palate.
Fantastic. Yeah, we'll dive more into the Wine Palate soon, but I didn't realize you had started with the Advocate doing New Zealand and Australia. So you really have covered, at some point, critical review for most major regions in the world. I guess you never really did like Italy. You've been all over.
Italy is its own thing. I love Italy, and I've been asked to do Italy. There's two areas that I would love to do. Three I'd love to do, and I do occasionally. I think they need experts to do them well, because I do cover some Italian wines when they happen to come my way. Burgundy is the other one. I spent a lot of time in Burgundy. When I was a wine buyer for the wine importer in Japan, I used to spend a lot of time. I'd go over several times a year on buying trips to Burgundy. So I know the region very well. And it was offered to me at the Wine Advocate. And I said, Oh no, that's too much work. Every producer makes like a barrel of this and a barrel of that, and you're tasting all of these small lots. So you might be with the a Burgundian domain, and you're tasting 20, 30, 40 wines, that they make 100, 200 cases of each, and it's a lot of work. And so that was the other one. And champagne, I love. I used to work for Clicquot and Krug when I was in London. I know champagne very well, and I love it. And I do cover champagne as they come up, but it's another region that I feel like somebody really has to do a deep dive into. And we'll talk about that later, but I do have someone coming up soon to do champagne for us. And we have somebody doing just Italy for us as well at the Wine Palate. But those are areas that, I haven't covered before, but I've done, most of the rest of the world.
Sometimes, and it's becoming much less so, but people used to just lump the New World all together. So they would lump the United States and Australia and New Zealand together. But how did tasting across Australia and New Zealand prepare you to move over to California? And knowing that they're dramatically different, did you have any preconceived notions coming in on what, you might be encountering in California based on what they were doing in New Zealand or Australia? Or was it you just knew they were completely different worlds?
They are completely different worlds, but there are crossovers and similarities, of course. What I loved about doing Australia and New Zealand at that time was it was at a time where, the wine scene for them was really starting to boom. People, collectors around the world were taking an interest in high-end wines out of Australia and New Zealand. And I spent a lot of time traveling. I spent a lot of time driving from across all of the regions of Australia and New Zealand, discovering things. I think the great thing about Australia is it gave me a heads up on things like climate change, the impact of climate change. Everything seemed to happen there before it really took a grip here in California. So things like bushfires and smoke paint, I already had the experience of from tasting those wines in Australia. And I spoke to people like Peter Liem at the AWRI, who's one of the leading specialists in smoke taint research. And so I understood a little bit better what was happening. Also things like heat domes and extreme heat events and the impact on vines that we're seeing now happening in California were already happening in the mid to late 2000s there. So it really gave me a little bit of a head start on anticipating where things were going to be going here in California.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was mainly asking because my own personal wine route, I started doing the first couple levels of the quartermaster sommelier in New York, and then I moved to Australia and worked at Harvest and lived there for a little while before moving to California. So I also went Australia then California, and it was just interesting to compare the two after driving around. Awesome. Well, I've buried the lead long enough. I would love now to dive into the Wine Palate. Can you share a little bit about what the platform is and what inspired you to make it?
Yeah, we all know, if once you've been in the wine industry a while, how slowly the wine industry moves compared to other industries. And I think the world is changing just so quickly. And the way that consumers buy products and buy experiences now is completely different than what it was 20 years ago. So, for example, we have Amazon, where you can very quickly filter and find the things that you're looking for. We have Airbnb, where you can plug in the type of experience or the type of accommodation that you want, and a broad range of filters so you can really hone in on that exact experience that you're looking for. And meanwhile, wine criticism and wine communication is stuck where it was largely 20 years ago with scores and tasting notes and all of the rest. And these are ways and limited means of being able to filter those in order to find the style of wine that you love. And for a long time, I'd been dreaming of doing a website where we could map behind the scenes, essentially, the technical aspects of the wine based on largely on taste, although I also have filters for things like alcohol level, which are more precise. And that can be based on either what's on a spec sheet, what the winemaker tells you, which is often different from what's on the label. And that's what I always try to put in, for example, on that. But also things like perceived oak. Can you pick up oak? Is it American oak? Is it French oak? Is it subtle? Is it pronounced? All of these things impact people's decisions and the sorts of styles that they like. Some people don't like to see any oak. Some people like to see a little oak. Some people love American oak. And being able to map behind the scenes a wine much more precisely so that the tasting note actually has more meaning. You can be filtered and found if you like a high level of tannins, if you like a medium or a low level of tannins. What level of acidity do you like? All of these things are now embedded in the background of all of the tasting notes that are in the wine palette. And it's actually the hardest part was actually coming up with all of those things because it's something that's never been done before. Okay. For example, the different levels of acidity and how to describe them to a consumer, because you can say high, medium, low, but maybe that is not quite as interesting as saying something like a soft acidity or crisp acidity, which are common terms that we use in the tasting notes and they're used to using, and then levels in between. So at the wine palette, we have 25 different filters now for every wine. And it sounds like it actually, when I first conceived of this, I thought, oh my God, how long is it going to take to do a tasting note and enter it? And actually it becomes surprisingly quick once you get used to doing it. It's only a little bit more extra work. And honestly, I think it's worth it. I think a lot of critics nowadays have maybe become complacent with just writing the tasting note and slapping on a score when there's so much more that we could do to make all of those different aspects that are definable within the wine searchable. And that's really one of the key elements that I wanted to do with the wine palette. And that's where I've developed what's called the palette matcher, which is a very advanced sort of search mechanism where you can really dial in the style of the wine you like. But I also appreciate that for a lot of people, they don't even understand what a lot of those terms mean, or maybe they don't even know what kind of level of tannin or texture type that they're looking for, or level of acidity. They just know what they like. They know that they've had this bottle of wine before, whether it's, I don't know, a Joseph Phelps Insignia or a Gila Grace or whatever. And they know that they love that style of wine and they want to find something that's like that, but not that. Maybe they're looking for something that's cheaper or something that is a little bit more high quality or whatever, because the style palette matcher doesn't take into account quality, although you can dial in if you want to the score range. Even if you don't know how to use all of those filters or exactly what you're looking for in terms of those filters, all you need to do is put in a wine into the search bar that's in the database that you know you've loved before, and it will come up with palette matches. So it will come up with a list of wines that match, and there's an algorithm that works in the background, weighting all of those parameters. For example, tannin level and body will get more weighting than something like a single aromatic compound, because that tends to impact style more. So you can see why it took me a long time to come up with, first of all, the filters, and second of all, the algorithm to make it work. But I feel pretty confident now that it's actually quite accurate when it comes to matching styles. So to use that example, if you were to put a Joseph Phelps Insignia in or Chateau Margaux, it will come up with a list of all of the palette matchers, and it will say beside it what percentage match it is. It might say a 98.2% match or a 95.6% match. Anything above a 90 is actually a pretty good match in terms of styles. And then it will also give you the score beside it, so you can look at quality alongside of the style and decide what wine is best for you. That's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's that's a big nutshell. Now that is so cool. I've been playing around with it since you shared access, and even while you were chatting, there was a few of the characteristics that I hadn't actually clicked the drop down. So I definitely want to ask in a minute about how you're going about filling up that back end. But I will say, what was the process for narrowing down like some of these? Like when I saw faults, for example, I was like, is there anybody like actively seeking out some of these? But when I clicked the drop down, I was like, oh, that's interesting. Like you have like balsamic in there, or like smoky or oxidized. And weirdly enough, like I sometimes have been like looking for like an oxidized white wine that maybe it's like an old Rioja style or like maybe a Chateau Musar white style sometimes. So I'm like, oh, I would actually use that. How did you narrow down something like faults? That seems difficult.
Faults you can't not mention faults, let's put it that way. And faults are when they're obviously noticeable and they take over the wine, they're a bad thing. But let's face it, all wines have a degree of wine faults. They all have a certain degree of volatile acidity. A lot of tannic red wines have a little bit of Brettanomyces. And so it's whether you can pick it up or not, and if it's notable. And that's when I'll mark it as having a fault. To your point, there are some people who like that little bit of balsamic character. There are people who want to find a smoke-tainted wine. Which wines are smoke-tainted? Because I'm not there to market people's wines for them. I'm actually writing for consumers. And it just so happens when, wines are great and they're wonderful, but it can be used as a marketing resource for a producer. I'm nothing if I'm not honest. And so many websites never call out things like faults. And so you don't know until you buy the wine. Oh, this has got some Brettanomyces. Why didn't that person tell me? And the ability to be able to filter and find who's got wines like that and who doesn't, I think is something that's very useful to people. And that's it. It has to be a tool. It has to be useful. It has to be meaningful. Because let's face it, there's a lot of meaningless jargon out there and a lot of people just doing marketing fluff for wineries and not actually operating as wine criticism websites.
Yeah, for sure. And I didn't mean to just start with the faults there. It was the first one I clicked on, but the other one's
an interesting one because nobody else does that, right?
Exactly. Another question I had is I also like the way that you have under intensity and fruit expression as well. As someone who's gone through a number of many different wine study programs, I know that jargon pretty well, and it never really translates for consumers when I try to explain what I'm putting down on a tasting note, say in like a WSET or an MW like setting. Then I really like what you have for intensity. You have shy and closed down, and then in fruit, evolving, as well as some of these other characteristics. My main question with that is, are you going to go back and update some of these for certain vintages over the years, or is it meant to just be a snapshot of when you tasted the wine at that time?
Yes, that is a very good question, because what I will have to, and for this to work, is when I retaste wines, for example, I'm tasting a wine now and it is youthful. In 10 years' time, it's going to be evolving or evolved, and it will start to have mature fruit. And that's what it will do, is the new tasting note will actually supersede that one. So the one that will come up in the palate matcher will always be the most recent one, and that will have the most recent tasting notes. Yes. And it happens all the time for all of the classic great wines of the world. We retaste them. And I try to do things like 10 years on tastings and all of these things. But yes, absolutely. Those things will be updated as the wine, we follow the wine through its trajectory.
Very cool. And then my last question in this little just wine characteristics section here is on the price side of things. I know prices can vary wildly depending on where you are in the world or even in the US. Are you just picking a general ballpark price for that, or is there a benchmark that you're working off of?
At the moment, there's two prices, and the palate matcher at the moment actually links into the actual price given by the winery. But if you look at the tasting note, it's actually plugged into Wine Searcher, and it will show you the average price around the world. And I asked my developer and Wine Searcher to let's do the average price in the world, not just in the United States or anywhere else. And it will actually, you can click through and go to that wine on Wine Searcher and then filter in your location and find it that way. But with the price on the actual palate matcher, there was an issue with, because I wanted it to link in with the average price on Wine Searcher. And eventually, I'm hoping I will find a way to do that, because that would be the ideal. But in the current way that we do it, my developer noticed to me that it would be too many call-ups on the site to have to do that. And it would actually make the website function very slowly. We're looking for a workaround. Let's just put it that way. But at the moment, on the palate matcher, it actually draws into the actual price that the winery has given me. When you go onto the tasting note on the tasting note page, it will show you in the column on the right the average price on Wine Searcher, and then you can click through to that to find the price in your location on Wine Searcher.
Yeah, that is fantastic. And yeah, I know that's a little inside baseball, but in both the companies that I've recently worked at, I'm very familiar with the paying for calls to the API for Wine Searcher. So I understand that world pretty well. One last question on this section is the food pairings. That's something you see maybe in passing in a tasting note, or maybe it's separate articles. That's fascinating. You can search by that, and you don't have just like a handful of things. There's a ton of options here in these food pairings.
I'm going to update that because I want to put some more options on there as well. Yeah, that's something that I will be updating. It's so easy to do. Like I said, if you're a critic and you've got a drop-down menu and you're thinking of things, that it will go with, it's just, for some people, it's meaningless. They don't really care. But for other people, they're like, oh, you know what? I'm having lobster. I'm having a steak. I'd like something really special in it. And just to have that in with your filters, in with your mix, to be able to say, I'm looking for something that will go really well with lobster, or really good with Peking duck or whatever. And then do all of the other filters. I want it to be a red wine or a white wine. And then you can come up with at least a list of really good options that you can purchase for that special occasion. So it's just, and the reason I put it on there is because for some people, they love it and it's important. And for me, it's just such an easy thing to do, to click for food options to go with that wine. If you're a wine expert, it's a no-brainer. You can do it very easily and very quickly, but it can make all of the difference for a consumer who's looking for a special wine for that dish, for that occasion.
Yeah, and then I love that. I love being able to add that to the filters that we already discussed. You can narrow all of it down. You don't have to go in two spots, and then when you get to that wine, again, with that link to the Wine Searcher or the website, that's so easy. Then you can just go buy it. That's perfect.
That's it.
So now taking, I guess, a step back or forward, however you want to look at it, with all of these parameters, that is great. But I know you guys have the monumental task of putting a lot of wines in the system and reviewing wines. So can you talk a little bit about your team for this process, and then what you will be covering? And you mentioned somebody's covering Italy and Champagne, how that's all going.
Sure, yeah. I cover comprehensively California and Bordeaux. And I have Vanessa Conlon, who is also a master of wine. She is doing Italy. So in fact, she's going over to Italy next week to do Brunello. And then we're about to announce somebody for Champagne in November. Champagne will be done comprehensive. So we're slowly growing. And then everything else for now, I do. As I see something that's of collector interest or just really good value or something that's of interest to the wine world, I did a fun report the other day on orange wines, which
I saw that.
I think all wine criticism I think I'm the first major wine critic to actually cover orange wines, because most of them stay clear like a barge pole. And I probably would have done that 10 or 15 years ago when they were still finding their way and there were a lot of faults and all of these things. But now I'm seeing this new wave of orange, or what some people call amber wines. And I thought, I'm just going to put that as a filter on there, because nobody adds it as a filter, first of all, on the website. They've got the 3 colors. But and although you might get a critic reviewing an orange wine, they put it under white. And so you'd never be able to find it. It's buried in the system somewhere. But a lot of these wines are beautiful, clean, pure, without any faults, age-worthy, and really fun. And I think as we're seeing consumers, or a large wave of consumers, trending towards more sort of savory styles that work well with food, I think, it's well worth doing something like that.
Yeah, no, I love that. I am one of those people, and I think I agree, especially particularly on orange wine. There were always those well-made traditional orange wines that were high quality and meant to age. And then obviously, like you mentioned, we've had this fad over recent decades. And now I do feel like it's the two ends are meeting. The people who were making wine just to hop on the fad are now making better wines. And the people who were making these long-lived traditional ones, I'm thinking of like Bradicon in particular, are also making like lighter, more approachable versions when they're young as well. So I think it's a perfect time to add this and bring it into the larger conversation.
I agree.
Yeah. So what is your goal in terms of reviewing in that process? And is it to get as many wines on the site as possible, or what is your kind of threshold for wine? Are people submitting to you? Are you actively seeking them out? Like, how does that process work?
The great thing is, like, I've been in the wine criticism business now for quite a while, and I've got a good feeling for what needs to be reviewed and what doesn't need to be reviewed. When I was working at the Wine Advocate and then at the Wine Independent, I'm one of those people who just loves to go on Google Analytics and see what are people reading, what is exciting to people, what tasting notes to get read again and again and again, and what never get read. There's a lot of tasting notes that never get read. And there's a lot of wine criticism publications who do play the numbers game. They're like, we just thousands and thousands and thousands of reviews. Here's some more. Really, I think part of our job as a wine critic is to guide people through that sea of wines on, what's really interesting, and put your own tastes and preferences aside and say, this is an interesting style. That's an interesting style. This is a new collector-worthy producer. And focus more on giving more information about that. And so that's why the other side of the wine palette that's significantly different from what other people are doing is the wineries stories side. There's a real focus on having a large number of winery stories, and I try to do at least 2 to 4 every week, because I studied English literature and performing arts, and I love telling stories. I love reading, but I like writing a lot as well. And every time I go to wineries, I love hearing their stories and then being able to tell their stories and have that as a place on the website so that people can easily find the story that they're looking for of the great producers of the world, or maybe the under the radar ones that they don't know about yet. And then having all of their tasting notes and reviews linked to that story so that somebody can quite easily just hop over to check out their wines, I think is something very new, unique, but it's where the wine world wants and needs to go. When we go and we're looking at a wine that we want to buy and you want to hear a little bit more, maybe you want to tell this story to your friends as you're serving the wine, or to your family when you brought out this special bottle. You want to go to a resource that can tell you, okay, the story. And I always try to write a story that hasn't been written before about them as well. I'll kind of like read everything that's been read and then say, okay, what can I say that's new and different that ChatGPT can't come up with? And that's why it usually involves a lot of interviews, and so that I can get original quotes, original content, and really pulling the story out of the owner and the winemaker about the winery. So that's another big part of the website.
Yeah, always great photography as well.
We're also visual nowadays, aren't we? With Instagram and social media. I think that it is an important part of the storytelling, having it visually look appealing and compelling, being able to see what the bottles look like, but not a stupid label shot or a bottle shot that's just so flat and dull, but really having some interesting photography of the labels, of the winery, of the vineyards, of the people, really brings all of those words to life. And I think that's equally important.
Yeah, certainly. And then, so the other features you have on here, you also have vintage reports for Bordeaux and Napa, and then you're going to have more editorials as well. Can you talk a little bit about those 2 sections?
Yeah, the vintage reports, that took a long time, and I'm still working on it. I think I've got 10 or 12. So the Bordeaux and the Napa ones go back to 1982. And the wines that are in the database are from those vintages are actually linked to those reports too. So you can go straight from the reports to seeing all the wines in the database from those vintages. And because I've seen lots of vintage charts, and of course I used to work on updating the Robert Parker vintage chart. It's one of the most popular areas on the website, but it used to frustrate me because like you would see the score for the vintage for a region, and I always wanted to do this. I wanted it to be able to click on that and go straight through to the vintage report, because the vintage reports were always buried somewhere. You'd be looking for them. Where is that vintage report for 1995 Bordeaux or whatever? And you'd be scouring. And I started with Napa and Bordeaux because obviously those are my areas of expertise. And I have a whole library of vintage reports that I've written for those. So that was easy for me to do. But we will be developing one for Italy. So Vanessa is going to be working on that. And all of the other major regions will be slowly adding onto the website. Again, when I was building this website, I was thinking about all of the things that I, as a consumer, would love to have on a website. And I know all of my own personal frustrations when I'm trying to look for things like that vintage report. I know it's there, but I can't find it anywhere. Or that winery story that was written about somebody 3 years ago. Why can't I find that? I just wanted to make this so easy for people to have an original resource of accurate, fact-checked information that is easy to find and access. And so that's what the website. And then the editorial, there's the latest review section. That's my section for just talking about what's going on during that month and putting all of the other tasting notes that don't fit into either a winery story or into a vintage report. They will go into the latest review section. And then that's not to say, so maybe I do a big Napa tasting with a whole bunch of producers and it will go into that. Just because it's gone into that doesn't mean that they can't have a winery story later. And that usually when I do the big tastings, I'm always looking for because first of all, I look for great wines. There's no point in telling a story if the wines aren't good. I look for great wines and then I look at the story and then I will write to them and say, oh, I'd really love to do a story on you. Can I come pop over to visit and interview you and check out your vineyards and your winery and maybe do a deeper dive into a vertical tasting, something like that, and do the winery story. So that's the latest review section is kind of almost like a testing ground. And then what I can do is the beauty of the website is I've built 3 websites now. I helped to convert Robert Parker Wine Advocate from what it was when it was originally built back in 2001, I think, over to, where it is today. And then the Wine Independent. So I knew what I wanted this website to do in terms of functionality and ease. And so even if I review a wine in the latest review section and later on it will get a winery story, it's so easy to link those archived tasting notes in that latest review section to their winery story when it publishes. And then all of their reviews that are in the database will be linked to their story.
Yeah, no, that's super nice to have. And going back quickly to the vintage notes too, I just wanted to note that, especially when you start going further back more than 20 years or so, many sites, even if they do have written reports or 2 sentences, or you don't get any context. So it's really interesting to have the full information. I was just clicking around and clicked on 1989, for example, and you have multiple paragraphs describing the vintage, which you definitely don't see elsewhere, which is great.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I wanted to do. There's no point in doing what everybody else is doing, right?
Yeah, for sure. So speaking of what everybody else is doing, I wanted to ask a couple broad questions now. Where over the past 20 years, obviously wine criticism has changed a lot. You mentioned ChatGPT and AI coming into the mix. What do you see as the role of the wine critic in this day and age?
I think it has to be an evolving role. I think that we can't get complacent and rest on our laurels with dishing out wine scores here, there, and everywhere, because those are becoming increasingly meaningless. I think we are guideposts advising people on what they should buy and what they shouldn't buy. And as I said, making that decision-making process easier for people using modern techniques like filtering systems and algorithms, I think is the way forward. We have to change with consumers and adapt to what they're looking for. Otherwise, and this is it, when Robert Parker came in and he made understanding wine quality so much easier with a score, that grew the wine market enormously. And we're seeing a shrinking of our wine market right now. Our industry is really going through some tough times. And part of it is our own fault. We need to make wine more accessible to people and easier to understand. And we need to make it so that people can find wine in similar ways that they're finding other products now, and accurately. They know what style of wine they like. They know that they've had a good experience. And we can say, my daughter's just turned 21, and she knows that she likes a kind of buttery Chardonnay type of thing. Trying to find one is nearly impossible for her. I know what her tastes are, and I can guide her. For her, when I'm showing her what I'm doing, and how she can easily either just put in a wine that she likes and find other wines like it, or she can learn to use the filters and dial it in once she gets the lingo and the language down, then that automatically makes it easier for her. Because let's face it, young people, well, all people, we don't have a lot of money to throw away on wines that are going to disappoint us. And people get frustrated and angry when their money is wasted, and they'll just turn away from the category. So what we need to do is make the category easier for people. And that's where I think wine criticism needs to go.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. I don't, as like a self-proclaimed wine nerd, I actually don't mind, like personally, when a wine tastes weird. So I'm like, oh, that's interesting why it tastes that way. Let me figure out why. But I it is probably like 99.9% of wine drinkers buy a bottle intending to hope it's perfect or exactly what they want, and then they want to enjoy it. I could see how that would actually be really frustrating if you just had one bottle and it wasn't what you wanted and you're stuck with nothing. Then, yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it. Cool. And then I wanted to ask about just like pulling the curtain back a little bit on your actual like wine tasting process. I don't think many people actually hear about like when a critic is going to a winery, or if they're in their tasting room, or over there you're tasting at your house. What is your process? Do you do some sort of special thing like they do in Somm, where they don't like brush their teeth for days or don't drink coffee, or do you have a routine?
No,
is there anything in particular?
I drink a lot of coffee. It's an easy one to exclude from your tasting. I always find that when people say, "Oh, I can't drink coffee," there's a bitterness to it for sure. That it's a short-lived bitterness. It's a very clean, simple flavor. So it's never really bothered me with my tastings. I do tastings both ways. I do a lot of winery visits. And so one of the great things is I'm based in Napa. And so I'm able to visit several Napa wineries. Sonoma's just on the doorstep. I go down to California's Central Coast at least a couple of times a year, and I'll stay down there for a few weeks. I do trips to Washington and obviously Bordeaux several times a year to taste in those areas. That's mainly to get the large tastings, but also the winery stories, the individual visits down. But I do taste from home as well. And I have some organizations like Napa Valley Vintners organize big tastings for me. And so it's a real mix. I taste fast. You have to be able to taste fast to be a wine critic. So if you're going to be a master somm or a master of wine, you have to learn to taste very fast too. And I taste technically, but I describe as in words that I think a consumer would understand. But for every word and term that I use in the tasting note, it actually correlates with consistency to a technical term that, and it's very easy for example, for me to look at one of my tasting notes and develop the mapping process across the 20 filters from looking at that tasting note, because I know exactly what I mean in terms of body, acidity, tannins, texture, all of those things. The tasting notes that I write them fast, and they might look like they're written for consumers, but there's actually a lot of technical details in there if you were to unravel them.
Yeah. Did it take a lot of coordination or practice with your other people that are coming onto your team or on your team now? Did you guys have to coordinate, or did you always just know their palate just from knowing them in the industry?
Yeah, and there's that. Yeah. And fortunately, Vanessa's also a master of wine, and we're on the same page on a lot of things. And I look at her tasting notes and how she's making things, and I'm like, wow. It's amazing when you've got somebody who, and that's the other thing. I think that for this wine criticism publication, but for all, having critics that are all on the same page in terms of what their terms mean and how they're describing things, and understanding wines not just in the context of what they taste, but in the context of the world. And that's, I think, an advantage of a master of wine or a master sommelier, that they taste broadly. And so being able to describe and evaluate a wine within the context of the world is something very important.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. And then I guess as we get closer to time here, I wanted to just ask another broad question on, you mentioned consumers maybe turning a little bit away from wine in some senses, coming back in other ways. Do you think the term like fine wine, or what people are looking for in a nice wine, has changed over the years? Or do you think there's almost like a pretentiousness now to the fine wine term, and people are just looking for interesting stories and quality wine?
It could be a contentious topic, but I think that there was a time and when a person could show up to a dinner party or an event with wine collectors and put a 100-point wine down on the table, and it would automatically be assumed that that was a fine wine. And I think that that's changing now, that consumers are wary of things like 100-point scores and people showing up saying, oh, I remember in the early 2000s going to wine events where you had to bring a 100-point wine. And that would be vulgar now. You just wouldn't do that, would you? And so that has all completely changed. And I do think that now what's more important is, yes, stories, an interesting story about a winery. I think people want to know the people and the place behind the bottles that they're drinking when they get to that next level. There's always going to be people who are interested in are really good quality $25 Cabernet. And that's something different. But when you get into what we term as a modern fine wine, I think people are moving away from things like scores and moving into, okay, give me an interesting story. And also, I think scarcity. People like a rare experience. And we're seeing a lot of the disposable incomes that people have nowadays going towards rare experiences. And I think wine has a place in that, but it's having some genuine scarcity, being small production, being made by a person that consumer can resonate with, and coming from a special place. And I think that where we see fine wine is changing for sure.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. I've seen it. I think the term has gotten a little bit diluted and washed out. I feel like everything is fine wine now. So I've heard a lot of people trying to use like collectible at certain stages, or like low production, or just even artisanal or hand. And it's an interesting time, because I also think moving back even longer ago, 30, 40 years, like fine wine could have just meant wine with no faults. But like baseline winemaking has gotten so good now that you need to go beyond faultless wine. So
you take that for granted now. Yeah.
So there's so many things to consider.
It's tough because we need to, I think the consumers are tired of all of those old terms, and we need to speak. And I always hate the term authenticity, but I do think we need to be more authentic, more real about the terms that we use and how we discuss wine. So it actually has some meaning and people aren't just rolling their eyes. I also think the term fine wine may have been sullied somewhat by the whole wine investment funds era, where people were like, oh, you can invest in the fine wine market and you'll pay a lot for money. And there were a lot of scams during that period as well.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. Well, one last question on that, or not on that, slightly different. And then just to wrap up, I wanted to get your quick take on recently released vintages, both in Bordeaux and Napa as well. What have you been seeing in the latest wines that come out that have been made physical, bottled?
Oh, okay. 2023 is the wines coming have just recently been bottled in both Napa and in Bordeaux. Napa, I'm tasting a lot of 23s at the moment. In Bordeaux, I'm going over in January and early February to taste the 2023s in bottle. Both really exciting vintages. After a little bit of a bumpy road there, 2022, let's face it, was a great vintage in Bordeaux. It was not so consistent here in Napa and parts of California. And so there was some pushback on that. So I think just having a nice, consistent, great vintage like 2023, particularly for Napa coming onto the market, because it was a cooler vintage here in Napa, but a great vintage. And so you've got these really bright, energetic wines that are defying people's preconceptions of Napa Valley wines. And it's the vintage that, we haven't seen, a type of vintage we haven't seen for some time, and we probably won't see again for some time. Although 2025 was quite a moderate vintage, but it was warmer than 23. So I think that those are going to be very exciting wines coming onto the market, particularly given that we went through a period of time where there were so many great vintages coming out of Napa, and there were so many great vintages coming out of Bordeaux that people got bored with it. And then we went through a bumpy road. So it's nice having a great vintage for both areas, for Cabernet and Bordeaux blend lovers that are coming onto the market soon, I think.
Nice. I always like to get different critics' points of view, and they all tend to be very similar, but everybody has their own, not very similar. If a vintage is good or bad, that's on the same page, but it's always good to get everybody's insights. So thank you so much. This has been great, and I really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. That was our interview with Lisa Perrotti-Brown. I hope everybody learned a little bit about her and the Wine Palate. Go check out the Wine Palate, dig a little bit in, create your profile, and enjoy more wine. But for now, that is our episode for this week. We'll be back with another 5 questions on Friday and another full episode next week. Cheers.